I think it's the times in 3 years that we haven't had it. So anyway, glad to be back. Really happy to see all you guys. And yeah, just thank you so much for joining. It's a beautiful summer Thursday. And my name is Jason Brand. I'm the Director of Outreach and Partner Development here at Supply Chain Solutions. And for this week's show, we have our Freight Market Roundup. So it is a quick and dirty breakdown of what's happening in the market. It really includes the rates that we're seeing in all of the major ocean shipping lanes, the major events, and key pieces of info that we feel better navigated just this complicated market of international logistics. So our goal here is keeping the show under 15 minutes. We want it to be able to fit really nicely right after lunch. But if that isn't a good time for you, we also have this show on basically anywhere you get your podcast. It's often duplicated. There's actually a couple out there with very similar names. So you really got to look for our logo. But if it's easier, you can stream it on the way into work or leaving work or just whenever you're in the car. When we review the show over here, that's the way I like to do it. And it's we've actually been getting some positive feedback on that too. So if you're having an issue finding it, make sure you reach out and let us know. Now, a little bit of housekeeping, just because, if it's your first time here, we don't have any visuals on this show, and we want to make sure it's really easy to follow along, so you don't get lost. So first things first, what I'm going to do is run through all of the major shipping lanes we discuss, and we're going to talk about the ocean rates we're seeing on those lanes. By the way, those numbers tend to be the average costs of shipments that we booked the week prior. Now, after talking about that content, we're going to dive into some of the major events that we're seeing affecting the marketplace. A lot of these things have been brought up by our internal teams, or a customer of ours has seen it and they've said, hey, what's your opinion on this? And we're like, you know what, let's just spread this out just because this is important. So we've tried to float those things up to the surface. Also, if you are a customer of ours and you're feeling that way about something, make sure you're reaching out to our teams. We love to kind of discuss it openly. It really brings some, but also just being able to communicate with all of you in our business community about the things going on, how it can help you, how it can hurt you, and kind of what to do about it is really the goal here. So we got a lot to cover, and I'm trying to get this done in 15 minutes. So let's just dive in. First things first, if you're a customer of ours and you have been shipping with us as of last week between Southeast Asia or China and the US West Coast, which is also known as our major lane, which is our Trans-Pacific lane, you probably noticed that last week, your shipment cost was down. And yeah, I'll say that again, because finally our shipping cost averages on this lane have been heading downward. And when we take a look at this lane in particular, it has actually been heading downward for a couple weeks now, which is a good sign. So currently we're seeing rates right around the $7,450 point. That's per 40-foot container. And that's down from a high that we saw the first couple weeks, actually first week and a half of July, where it was right at the $8,000 point, which is crazy high, especially given this time period. Now, the question really is, will this continue? And quite frankly, it more than likely will. Now, I'm going to talk about this through a slightly different lens here in a moment. But the key thing you need to remember here is that there is this big fly in the ointment, and that is we've got this ILA negotiation going on, and that could artificially raise rates back up as we approach the deadline here in September. So keep that in mind. But for now, let's move on. Not headed too far. We're going to stay on that Trans-Pacific, but let's just talk about a different destination. I want to talk about those shipments headed out of Southeast Asia and out of China, but now headed into the Mexican West Coast. So the trend we've been seeing here is very similar. The peak prices on this lane, they actually hit a little bit earlier, back at the end of June. And at that point, they were right around the $7,600 point per 40-foot container unit. Now, we are seeing rates slide downwards as well, but pretty steadily. So right now, as of last week, our shipment average was $6,250. Now, we've seen this trend on this lane over the course of the year so far. And one of the things that we've been noticing, and it's been pretty clear, there hasn't been too many events to really make a clear trend of this, but it has been clear enough that, this lane is a bit of a canary in a coal mine of sorts for the US market, at least so far in 2024. And when we saw Asian imports really have that huge boom earlier in the year, it was the Mexican shipments that actually saw the steepest slope in terms of price increases. And we've quoted this number before, but we saw shipment costs soar by more than 280% in less than 60 days. And the thing that just keeps mind-boggling me is it wasn't, the same amount of capacity on that lane. There was new services getting added, new vessels getting added. But despite all of that, it was an extremely steady and steep increase in price we saw. Now, so far, we're seeing the opposite, and this lane has dropped off. And it's really doing so in that same rather steep way. So this really begs the question, is this drop off a clear sign that we're going to be witnessing the same thing for the US West Coast shipments? Now, I kind of mentioned this, but the answer is likely yes. Now, not in the same dramatic fashion. There's a lot of reasons behind that, but likely yes. And we're seeing consistency in both that price increase and also the price decrease on this lane in particular. So let's keep the show on the road. Let's make a move. Let's go over to the transatlantic. Specifically, I want to talk about shipments that are leaving European ports and they're headed into the US East Coast. Now, here we are seeing no change at all. I mean, the price has been so incredibly flat. It's a little mind-boggling. Over the course of the month, we might have fluctuated $10. It's at $1,800 per 40-foot container unit. And just as a reminder here real quick, these numbers that we're mentioning, it's 100% the ocean portion. It's nothing beyond. So make sure when you're comparing these prices to your invoices, just pull it up, run through the line items. This is the ocean portion of your shipment. Now, I don't want to dive into some of the reasons why this is happening on the East Coast lane at this moment, but let's quick wrap up what's going on in the major ocean shipping lane that everyone's most frustrated about and likely will be, unfortunately, for the continued future. And that is our final one we discussed in the show, China, Southeast Asia, headed to European ports. Used to head through the Suez Canal, but, that's really rolling the dice at this point. So despite all of the continued challenges that we're seeing shipping on this lane, you've got this substantially longer transit time. And, obviously we discussed just the other week, some major weather events that basically stopped or rerouted all of the vessels. But despite all of that, we're still seeing a slow creep upwards. And, back when we looked to the first week of July, you were looking at roughly 8,000 per 40-foot equivalent unit, or FEU, when shipping on this corridor. Now, currently, we're looking at $8,450. It is a substantial change. There's no doubt about that. But in the grand scheme of everything that's occurring, it's really relatively stable. So I think the question here we've got to ask ourselves is, just thinking about all of those lanes in general, thinking about the differences between them, what is really going on? Because quite frankly, the signs of the market heated up or headed back to normal, they could be false flags. And we touched on this a little bit in the past. And that's because we've got this disruption that's been very consistent and it's creating this artificial supply crunch, which is making things just more challenging. But, what we see the most, obviously, what all of our customers see the most is it's more costly than it should be. And when I say than it should be, compared to the actual amount of volume that is being moved. And so, one of the topics I want to talk about today is DSV's financials. They released them. I think they're a really excellent look at what's going on across the market and what they're struggling with. I think it tells a really good story about the market so far in 2024. And one of the things you do have to remember is, all these comparisons are going back into 2023. And that was a notably bad year for shipping. So when you think about growth and you think about the numbers of growth, remember, growth was not only expected this year, it was required this year. So, take those numbers with a little bit of a grain of salt, but let me quick summarize it for you. So DSV, they saw a 6% year over year increase in ocean freight volume. It brought them up to a total of 1.3 million TEUs handled in total. Also on the air cargo side, they saw a similar trend. In total, they moved 684,000 metric tons. Now on paper, the increases were healthy, yet despite those gains, their first half revenue rose by only 2% to 11.5 billion, and their gross profit actually fell by 6.3%, which brought them down to 3 billion. This happened also fell along with their EBIT, their earnings before interest and taxes, which dropped by 16.6%, bringing them down to 1.1 billion. So you just take a mile high look at this, and the mile high takeaway here is that DSV is doing much more for much less. Now, their CEO, Jens Lund, went on to say that he's cautiously optimistic about the continuation of this solid air and ocean volume growth in the marketplace. And he's cautiously optimistic about it continuing into the third quarter. But on the flip side, He did make it a point to mention that DSV is seeing signs of demand peaking. So in my mind, he's expecting the growth to continue, but in a modest way in comparison to what they saw in the second quarter. And, I've got some of the second quarter financials and discussion around that. It was a little bit messy. So we can talk about that in the next few weeks. But for now, this kind of shows the general consensus of what was happening. Now, during the financials, they switched over to talking about air cargo and air cargo's peak season. And you could really see his tone just completely change. So he definitely doubled down on that cautious side of the cautiously optimistic for his outlook. And he pointed to these potential issues like the changing market dynamics. And he pointed to governmental changes, kind of hinting at the US presidential election being big influencers on really how air's peak season may unfold. We're going to discuss air rates here at the end of the show, but one of the things we are seeing is, air is softening a little bit right now. And that was a little bit surprising because it was sitting so expensive for so long, which was very frustrating for a lot of our customers. And I'm sorry if you had to ship air. Oh, just definitely not fun. But I do like that breakdown. I really do. And I think it shows that, what we're having is a lack of quality market growth at the moment. And, but at the same time, you can clearly see there is movement occurring, which is also critical. Earlier in the year, we actually went through JB Hunt's financials, and it told this similar story of massive growth, but only in certain areas, and then actually losses in other areas. And, we do have to kind of revisit JB Hunt's as well. I think they also give a really good indication of the market, but we'll do that in a later show. Now, other news, something I want to talk about, the FMC. And this is a little change that could have a huge effect. They're rolling out some new rules. So the rules require ocean carriers to document their export handling policies. They need to notify shippers about any scheduled changes in advance. They've got to ensure that there's adequate loading time for ships to create a fair environment for exporters. Now, this really is a long time coming. It's in response to some complaints, mainly coming from the U.S. agricultural shippers and other exporters. But this problem has been happening for a while. We obviously saw it a ton in the pandemic. If there was a silver lining to the pandemic's effect on supply chains, you really saw the weak points. And you also saw some of the concerns if let run loose. And one of the things that was happening was ocean carriers were prioritizing the return of empties to Asia over picking up full containers and shipping them. So the new rules require ocean carriers, they need to annually file a documented export policy that needs to be filed with the FMC. It has to break down a lot of things, actually. It's got to outline their pricing strategy. It's got to detail their services, their routes, and all of the equipment they have available for U.S. exports. So the policies here, they're going to be used by the FMC to determine if carriers are unreasonably refusing export shipments with blank sailings or schedule changes without sufficient notice. And, they could start to bring cases to unreasonable refusals. So there's kind of a very similar topic here that they specifically wanted to address, this idea of cut and run moves. It's really where ships leave port earlier than scheduled and they leave export cargo behind. And they really assert that the vessel operators are responsible for scheduling adequate load time. And additionally, if they're pricing outbound ship export services significantly above the current market rates, and it's also deemed unreasonable, that's also an issue as well. So, carriers can refuse exports. That is still allowed. Obviously, the carriers are these entities. They need to ensure that, they're doing business properly. But the reasons they can refuse cargo is changing. And that's really a big deal here. And now the FMC's kind of got a seat at the table to determine if that's okay or not. Obviously, you've got reasons for like safety, operational reasons. They're able to refuse on that effect as well. So these changes to policy are likely going to show up in the next 60 days. There is a couple more things that are pending, but you probably will see these changes come into effect. This is a big deal because, quite frankly, I feel like this is a step in a direction of enforcing ocean contracts. And we've seen this in the past. Obviously, during the pandemic, you have a contract with a carrier and they're not honoring the amount of volume you have at that rate in the contract. Next thing you know, they're going for this high volume spot market and you're kind of left at the dock. And the question is that fair? How do I, why did I sign this contract? What's the value of this? And, I think the good news about what's happening, I hate to say good news because these disruptions are so incredibly painful for so many companies, but they do expose and they do keep some of these big issues on the table long enough where change can happen. Now, I also have this overarching view here, right? That, I think principally you put too much regulation on an area, you're really hindering growth. And you can also artificially drive up costs. So, in defense of this situation, kind of like I've discussed, we've seen these problems occur. And when these ocean carriers go into free-for-all mode and they stop honoring these contracts, it can be really damaging to all of us. But this is an interesting point. When I was reading this article and we kind of discussed it as a team, I'm really curious to know how you guys feel about the FMC getting involved in this way. I know where the U.S. agriculture shippers feel. I know how they feel on this. They were really put in a bad spot for a long time, particularly during the pandemic. But I am curious because this is a lot of regulation coming into that realm. It could kind of stifle competition, but please reach out. Let me know. So let's talk about air freight rates. So air freight, what we're seeing right now, and we're specifically going to focus on shipments coming in from Asia into the US. So currently our customers are paying an average of $6.13 a kilo. That's $6.13 a kilo to air ship from the Asia to US. That's across all origins. Now we're seeing a low at $5.51 a kilo and a high of $6.36 a kilo. Really appreciate everybody joining us today. Those are some two big topics, and we wanted a quick touch on them. But please let me know in the comments about specifically the FMC getting involved, because this has been a very, very long time coming. There's been a lot of legislation that's been inching this direction, and I feel like this change may go under the radar for some people, but it really has more teeth to it than many people realize. Anyway, appreciate you guys joining. Thanks. Make it a great day.